Well, I have to say it's a pleasure to be here today. This is my fourth meeting. We were part of a small group that was part of the steering committee, and we've seen it grow over the years. The reason why this is one of my favorite meetings is not only because great learnings, but also the opportunity to be able to network with my colleagues. So I look out and I see a lot of familiar faces, and really looking forward to catching up later on during the cocktail hour. But so at this point, I'll introduce myself, and then I'll have my esteemed panelists introduce themselves. Many of you might know me already. Kathy Graham. I am Vice President of Patient Advocacy at Snow Companies, which is a full-service patient engagement agency. And prior to joining Snow, I spent about 7 years, actually close to 8 years at Takeda Oncology as Director of Patient Advocacy. And then if we go way back, my background's nursing. I spent some time mostly in oncology, worked in hospice for a little while, and then I got into industry, sales and marketing, running a sales organization. And then I was diagnosed with late-stage colorectal cancer, which is what really led me to patient advocacy. So I thought that if I could use my nursing background, my communication skills, my personal experience with cancer, and be able to help patients, then it would be both personally and professionally rewarding. So tell this story. I went to Medzilla, which is like the monster.com for finding jobs. Some of you may be aware. But I put the word patients in, and then patient advocacy, and I was so fortunate that this position was right in my backyard. So I remember going on the interview, I was so confident, thinking that there's no possible way they can't hire me, because you know how many people have had cancer and are nurse, and I got the job, and then once I started working in the corporate environment, I was like, whew, I was really lucky to get that job. And that was 10 years ago. So anyway, that's my story.
Meg Wood, Director of Development for Cure Duchenne. As you know, Duchenne has a very, very robust patient advocacy force. In fact, I see many familiar faces out there. Pleased to be part of the panel today talking about such an important topic. So thank you.
Hi everyone, Lillie Stairs. I am first and foremost here, like so many of you, because I'm driven by the patient. I am a patient myself, and I'm excited to say that this month is actually 4 years of remission for me because from my autoimmune diseases, because of everyone here and the people who work in this industry. So kudos to all of you. I actually got my start at MassBio, where I helped conceive and execute the patient-driven campaign. So I'm very excited to see that it's still alive and well. And then transitioned into agency for a little while, where I was working with early-stage biotech companies to help them with their patient advocacy programs. And now I am currently the head of patient advocacy at Clara Health, which is a startup working to make clinical trials more accessible to patients and help support patients and hold their hand through the process of getting enrolled into a clinical trial.
I'm Maleh Harper, head of commercial for Axia Therapeutics. Axia is based here in Boston, over the river in Cambridge. And we're a company that's focused on late-stage development and commercialization of therapies for cardiometabolic disorders. And our lead compound, volanesorsen, has currently been filed in the US, Europe, and Canada for a rare disease, familial chylomicronemia syndrome, and is also being studied for an additional rare disease, familial partial lipodystrophy. I think what's exciting about being here, and we're very much honored to be represented as part of this panel on this day, is that those were rare diseases that actually were not visioned as part of the initial discovery of the molecule that came about during the development process. So it's just one of the different ways in which industry can respond to the needs that are brought forward from the rare disease community. So really excited to be here. I'm also an alum of Merck, so it's great to be in the Boston building, which I haven't been in before.
Great, thank you. For purposes of this panel, I thought it might be helpful just to define what we mean by discovery. Discovery is really screening compounds against biological targets to modify disease. So we're talking about even before going into the clinic. And kind of interesting, a year and a half ago, we were running a patient advocacy group summit, a day-and-a-half program, And as part of that program, we broke out into small working groups. And one of the topics that came up from an advocacy group was that they really felt there was a strong need, an unmet need, because they weren't really being asked, but to be able to give input as to what should these targets be, what are the unmet needs that companies should, when they're looking at molecules, that they should be talking to patients so that they can understand whether there's even a need for a particular therapy before investing thousands and millions of dollars. So when I was doing a little bit of research for this panel, I did come across, I'm sure many of you are aware of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. Is everybody aware of that? It's a great website to go to. They do have recommendations for how to involve with patient groups. And initially, when I read through their recommendations, when they referenced patient groups, I was just thinking of advocacy groups. And then I read the small little print, and actually, it's a lot more than patient advocacy groups. They surveyed disease advocacy organizations, voluntary health agencies, nonprofit research foundations, and public health organizations. No individual patients. But they had some general rules for engagement, and I'm just going to read them to you. Pretty brief. I didn't really get a chance to memorize them. But, and actually what's interesting is that when you read through these rules of engagement, it's really how you would engage with anyone, like any partner, whether it be, you know, children, husband, spouse, friends. It's just kind of common golden rule. So the first one is engage the patient voice by establishing partnerships from the beginning of an R&D program to improve trial design and execution. From the start, clearly define the expectations, roles, and responsibilities of all partners, including resources being committed, data being shared, and objectives of the program. Build the trust required for successful partnerships by being transparent and trustworthy, following through on commitments, and honoring confidentiality, and involve the expertise of multiple partners for a broader perspective to mitigate risk and enrich pipeline development. And then manage real or perceived conflicts of interest by establishing policies that require full disclosure, transparency, and accountability. And as I said, it's pretty obvious, but this being truthful and honest from the beginning as to the expectations, I think, is really critical. You know, when I started in patient advocacy a long time ago, people would ask, when do you get involved with patient groups? At what stage of the drug development cycle? And back then, the rule of thumb was 18 months. Now, why people, you know, a lot of my colleagues, we all always said 18 months. I'm not sure where that came from. I think we were, there was a little bit of caution about engaging too soon, because what if your molecule or your drug didn't make it to the market and you've already been engaging with these groups? Well, fortunately, the trend now in the past 2 years is to get involved very, very early. And I promise I'm not going to say that too many times, engage early and often, because I think by now people get the message. So now I'm going to turn it over to my panelists. And I think, you know, I think I'll start with you, Lilly, and maybe you can talk about how you engage the patient voice at Clara.
Sure. So we have a couple of different ways that we engage with patients. I would say it's a 3- or 4-pronged approach. So we do have a patient advisory board. That was the first and foremost. And I will say that I was brought on as a member of the founding team as head of patient advocacy. So the patient voice has been integrated from the very beginning. And our patient advisory board helps oversee the work that we're doing. They're an amazing sounding board for us, a way for us to check in and gut check to make sure that what we're building is really relevant to patients. We've also built partnerships with patient advocacy organizations like so many of you. And that's actually been really interesting. And we can talk a little bit about that later, because I think that's a bit of a challenge in some ways for a discovery stage company, in that you're not really so sure how to communicate next steps, and being honest about the fact that, well, we don't know what's going to happen because we're discovery stage. And this notion of, well, we don't have a ton of money to give grants. like maybe some of the bigger pharma or biotech companies can give. So what ways can we collaborate? And I think there's a lot of value in trying to conceive ways that we can collaborate that isn't just in exchange of money. And so we've done some work in that area, and I can talk about that later. And then as well as our Breakthrough Crew Ambassador Program. And over the past 6 months, we've built an ambassador program comprised of patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals who are all dedicated to raising awareness about the power of breakthrough research in clinical trials. And so they are our stewards across the country who go into support group meetings and talk about clinical trials, and they share that on social media. And so, and then our ambassadors are also, and our patient advisors come back and they give us feedback on the platform we're building. And so we're constantly interfacing with them to figure out ways that we can improve the whole process.
Yeah, I think your point about not always having to write a check or provide money, I think that's a really good point, because especially if you're an early stage company trying to seek capital, you're not going to have the funds. So there's things that you can do. You can provide data to, exchange data, market research, provide training, possibly.
I would say education too around clinical trials themselves and the process and what is discovery, what is a molecule, sort of supporting that notion too to prevent from disappointment if something isn't to work out for that particular patient population.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Maleh, did you want to talk a little bit? I know you had mentioned that your organization really looks at patients more as thought leaders or KOLs or POLs.
Yeah, I mean, I think the prior panel, I think the panelists made a similar point, in terms of just thinking about, of course, patients are a key stakeholder. If you think about traditional drug discovery, the traditional discovery process, if a company has a technology or a molecule, when they think about what is a potential indication or disease for this, typically that next step is, okay, who has published on this protein or this gene, right? And then they might go to talk to those scientists, and then that might lead them to a certain number or a certain single or multiple disease states. Then they might go to speak to the physicians or the scientists who have published particularly around those disease states. And that's typically where thought leader engagement starts in the discovery process. I think the difference in rare, and it probably could happen, I think it should be beneficial in large diseases too, is that at that point, you also talk to the patient organization if one exists. And even if one doesn't exist, there can be appropriate means of connecting with patients who are able to speak to their disease experience. And the reason why that's so key, early on is because knowing the aspects of that disease, which are usually, in the case of rare, not well characterized because it's a rare disease, right? And usually the literature is scant. That can actually even affect animal studies, right, in terms of endpoints you look at. It's not just phase 3 and post, not even just phase 2 and dose ranging. It actually can even go into the preclinical program.
That's great. We had talked a little bit earlier about a recent experience you had that really clearly demonstrates how important it is.
Yeah, and it sounds very similar to your own, is that I'll call them out because they're here, Wave Life Sciences. Yesterday had a big event. And what became so apparent from their experience is that they engage patient advocacy groups / patients pre-discovery, and that they are working on 3 platforms for 3 different types of diseases, and there were multiples from each of those represented yesterday, and it was incredibly moving from a drug company perspective. Alternatively, I've heard of other companies that are at clinical trial stage and are having a hard time recruiting because they have not done that engagement. So it really does, as referenced earlier panel, it really does impact the future of your product and your possibility.
Lilly, did you want to talk about anything in particular that you're proud of that you've done while you've been at Clara?
Yeah, so I'll expand a little bit on the Breakthrough Crew Ambassador Program, because I think that's been something that has really laid a foundation for strong engagement at our company with patients and with the community. So we are engaging with patients across therapeutic areas, from chronic pelvic pain to cancer to Crohn's disease, and caregivers as well, who, as we all know, have just as much a voice in all of this. And these ambassadors have been really incredible stewards for us of the importance of clinical trials and breakthrough research, and trying to destigmatize clinical trials and raise awareness about them as a treatment option, which, as we all know, is not always the case. It's not always brought up as a treatment option in the doctor's office. And so that's something that in my role and having a dedicated patient advocacy role at the discovery stage that we've been able to build, and we're really proud of at Clara, because we feel that we are helping to raise awareness and bring education to communities across the country about an issue that it's really important that patients understand.
Maleh, you were recently at Global Genes.
Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit about what your talk was on?
It's a great build, actually, on what Lilly was describing. So there's a day at Global Genes where they had presenters who spoke to different technologies, and the audience being patient advocacy leaders. And what does that mean for you? And could this technology possibly work for your disease? And in my case, I was speaking about antisense therapy with a colleague from Ionis Therapeutics, but there were then additional panelists or additional presentations that day on gene therapy, monoclonal antibodies, and the like. But our key message was that, companies know that there are thousands and thousands of rare diseases, and it's impossible for any individual or any organization to know what they are. But as a patient advocacy leader, what we were trying to, or with that audience, what we were trying to do was lay out, these are the kinds of targets from a scientific perspective that work well with our technology. So if you know that your disease or the disease that you're focused on or fits this, then we want to hear about it, right? And I think that's true of any company that has a platform as a technology. Everyone is looking for ideas and ways to help patients and wondering if their technology could. So in our case, it was about outlining, diseases where the primary origin might relate to a protein synthesis defect in the liver, right? Was one of our key points, right, as it related to antisense technology. And there were others, and every drug platform would have its own. But our point was, it's great for patient advocacy leaders to be sensitized enough to their science and to absolutely feel empowered to be advocates and reach out to companies, because companies absolutely recognize that the science is rapidly changing, it's rapidly advancing, and we definitely don't know it. And absolutely, if a patient advocacy leader may have a good fit idea.
Yeah, we oftentimes get asked to help identify patients that can give insights. So what oftentimes we do is put together a landscape analysis. We have tools to be able to measure reach and influence of particular patients. We call them POLs, patient opinion leaders, and then be able to stratify them according to tiers. And generally the tier 1, or we call them Uber patients, are great patients to be able to provide insight. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about registries.
Yes.
And I know you love that topic. It's such an interesting topic.
It's so fascinating, yeah.
So perhaps you can.
Well, I know in the Duchenne space, we have, there are a lot of registries that exist, but because it is a rare disease and it's not necessarily required, the information is fragmented. And sort of the goal, I think, for our community in particular, and I hope that you jump in here too, because I know you love registries as much as I do, is to really get to the patient experience level registry to fully understand what the patient is going through their disease state. For Duchenne, boys lose ambulation, and often pharma companies don't even know when that happens for the patients that they're engaging with. It's not like it's not a known fact. It's a patient experience that is not yet reported, and it's valuable information like that that can be intersected between the two pharma companies and patient population with a little technological advancement, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you guys are working on.
And I think that's there's so many opportunities for synergies, especially when a patient advocacy organization has a registry. It's such a great starting point for somebody like a Clara Health or a pharma company or a biotech company to come in and to be able to collaborate and say, okay, these patients are giving this information over, and how can we help them? Some of them may just want to give their information because they want to help give back to research, but some might really be in need of a treatment.
Right.
And so how can we encourage them to both get into this registry and then look into options? Right. Maybe that is an existing treatment option. Maybe that is through a clinical trial.
You want to comment?
Registries, such a big topic.
Such a big topic.
I feel like I'm in I think 5 times a day a registry topic comes up. I'm going to say maybe 2 points that might sound a little contradictory. One is that you know, at scale, right, registries are so powerful. They also can be, you know, the design is so sensitive because if they become very onerous for patients to enter or medical staff to enter, then that can cause people not to enter data, and you know, there you know, lose the power of the registry. On the other hand, I would say that even if you have the smallest group of patients in the world, just literally, you know, compiling basic information, let's say you had 5 people, even to put together when were our first symptoms, when were we diagnosed, what kind of doctor diagnosed us, you know, what is our parent situation, whatever that information is, even literally for 5 of you, grouping that information, you know, you can do it like on Google or SurveyMonkey or something like that. Even that is helpful as a start.
Great point. I know when I was at Takeda, we were putting together a registry, and what was really helpful was to get, again, a group of patients together. We had a patient leadership council, which was a steering committee really for the company through all functions. But they helped Med Affairs really figure out how to, you know, attract patients, you know, not only recruit patients to the registry, but also retain them, which is also a big challenge. Maleh, you had mentioned that your organization put together a quality of life and disease burden.
So it's a good segue from registry because there was no registry for the disease that we worked on. And it was really apparent the first time we convened a patient advisory board that the experience that the patients were living, the people, and from their entire life and their daily lives was completely absent in the medical literature, which is really common in rare diseases because very few physicians have multiple patients, right? So because that was so clear, you know, led by Medical Affairs, just as you just described, took the initiative of launching a survey to capture quality of life, disease burden, effects of the disease. And it was challenging because it's a disease that patients generally are not diagnosed, like a lot of rare diseases. But even the patients who are under good care, for example, at our clinical trial sites, weren't ever told they had the terminology was completely varied. So it's not something where there was an existing organization or kind of a natural way you could recruit. So it was a pretty heroic effort. I mean, it really involved a lot of one-on-one conversations by, you know, the lean team we had at the time. But it's been published, it's been presented. The response, both from physicians and patients, has been really, really wonderful. And what we're hearing from those affected by the disease is that it's so validating for them to see in science, to see in a medical forum what they live with being presented. But it's effectively a little bit of a workaround because the information didn't exist in a registry. Big initiative.
Is that a cost burden or was it a holistic burden?
It was more holistic. So it was patient reported, right? So people, you know, we didn't ask for specific numbers or finances or, you know, financial impact because it was also global. And there's so much variability globally in the cost of hospitalizations and things like that. And people don't necessarily have their records, right? But what we did ask were questions that people can answer about themselves. So how many times have you been hospitalized? Effect on work. So is your profession or your work choice affected? Are you employed? Are you partially employed? Questions like that. And that then can be used. You can triangulate that into economic specifics, but that was the way we got at those aspects that can be translated.
And you published the paper, so it's...
Yeah, we published it so far as a poster, but it's in the, you know, manuscript has been generated. Yeah, it's been presented.
Meg, are there any formal models in place to be able to incorporate the voice of the patient into what you're doing?
Formal, no. There's a lot of informal, though. We have, as I mentioned, a very robust patient advocacy force in the Duchenne community. And fortunately, we have the good fortune of having lots of pharma companies working on the disease, most of them here in Boston, Cambridge. And I think that actually that brings up a sort of weakness that I've been thinking about in the advocacy community is really trying to query our pharma partners that we have or potential pharma partners that we could have about what they would really need from us and when and why and sort of how we could really facilitate that in a more uniformed way for everyone. Currently, we operate 12 workshops across the country annually. And those workshops are intended to bring the pharma partners to the patients. And we don't just pick cities, we pick small communities as well to try to really spread awareness as well as we can across the country for Duchenne patients that may not be near a medical center. And the purpose of that is to introduce ongoing or upcoming clinical trials directly to the patient population. In this case, obviously, it's a pediatric disease. The patient population is both the parents and the child. So that's our formal model of sort of uniting the two, bridging the voice to the pharma partner.
Did either one of you want to comment on that as well?
I think you captured it all.
Any tips you want to share, Lilly?
I think that, and this has come up a couple of times in terms of when we talk about ROI or why you bring in patient advocacy, and I think it's really difficult, especially to justify at the discovery stage for certain people. The certain people who recognize that patient advocacy, we should absolutely have it, they're all set. We know what to do. But there are going to be professionals and leadership who isn't always receptive to that, and that's something I hear a lot about, especially in the discovery stage. You don't see a lot of people in my position at other digital health or early stage biotech companies, and so you know, I've really been trying to do a lot of thinking about how we convince these people who maybe don't believe. And I think that we need to start looking to other industries and seeing how they are working with consumers, because the patient in many ways is the consumer, right? And the patient is becoming empowered to be making their own healthcare decisions, just like consumers are. And so I recently was listening to a podcast, and I'm gonna take us into the tech world and talk about Airbnb for a minute, which we all know is a really extremely successful company. They were in their early stages close to failing. They were almost out of funding, and the co-founder was going out to raise, and he was so stressed out, they didn't know what they were going to do. He flew from California to New York, which was one of their early, where they started, where they had some customers who were listing their apartments to be on Airbnb. And it was when he knocked on the doors of the people who were listing their homes and went in and had conversations with them for a week, every single day, that he unlocked what the whole problem was with their current platform. And from there, he was able to fix it, and the rest is history. Of course, Airbnb is this massively successful company. So what we can learn from that, and there's so many other examples of this in consumer-facing industries who are constantly running focus groups and talking to the people who use their product. Why wouldn't we be doing that in the biotech and pharma and digital health industries? It makes absolutely no sense not to talk to the end user. And so I've been trying to use that analogy when talking to people who maybe aren't believers yet in why we need patient advocacy at that early stage. Because that Airbnb example, they were early stage, and that was the turning point for them.
That's a great example. I mean, I know that now we're getting called a lot to work with these patient experience teams. Everybody's using the word patient centricity, and a lot of times, especially emerging biotech companies, the scientists have been behind the bench. They haven't even had an opportunity to ever even meet a patient. So we're trying to bring in not just hear a patient talk, because that's kind of a one and done type thing, but really having the face of the patient be throughout the building, videos, doing workshops, having employees be able to simulate the patient journey. We even put together an app for one company where employees were going through the daily routine for a few days of what a patient in that category was experiencing. An alarm would go off, every time they'd have to take a pill or go to the restroom, or interruptions.
I love that.
It was really very, really well received. And I've actually had the experience where we were doing a patient summit, patient advocacy group, where a CEO said, I've never spoke to a patient before. How do you speak? What do you say? How do you speak to a patient? And it's like, well, have you ever been sick? I mean, I think we all are patients at some point, so they're just like you. Anyway, so, well, I know we're only a few more minutes to lunch, which everybody's looking forward to. So I'd like to open it up for any questions anyone has. I have one question I want to ask the panel. This is a surprise question.
Oh, bonus question.
You're making the point about how do you convince senior management that it's necessary to get patient insights. Is there anything specifically, like with ROI or anything that you've been able to do to convince?
I don't think it's an analytical issue. I mean, I think if you can identify a path, a potential indication that, I mean, that's what a company exists on, right? That's in the discovery stage. I mean, obviously in the development stage, I mean, it's there. The cost of enrollment, the cost of delayed enrollment is the #1 headache at every single company that is in clinical trials, whether you're Merck or the smallest startup in the world. And patient connections and connecting to the patient community has been shown time and time again to accelerate enrollment. My tip, just based on what I heard before, is in addition, I think your point is great. It's funny, I brought up Airbnb too with my team recently. It's such a great example. But just to bring up examples, meetings like Global Genes, you hear about so many great cases of disease foundations, and they could be, again, the most unusual, something you've never heard of, but you'll hear about how they had a really effective website, or someone there understood their protein that was involved in their disease and advocated to a company about it. So I think I think it'd be hard to, it's not about the ROI because it's so dramatically positive. It's not, it's exponentially positive. But I think it's about showing an example, because if a person hasn't worked with a patient organization before or a patient leader, they just don't have a sense of it. Right? But I'd say, bring those examples, show them, network, find out about examples or analogs, because there have been already a tremendous number. For me personally, even though we had been dealing with our own rare disease clinical trial enrollment challenges, last winter I read the book How to Survive a Crusade, which is about the origins of the HIV advocacy movement in the 80s. And it was tremendously eye-opening and galvanizing for me. That's the organization which spawned the FDA to even have a patient department in the first place. It was originally the AIDS Patient Relations Office. Now it's patient relations. But for me, even understanding that analog and that book, which went through it in such detail, was very powerful and eye-opening. So I would just encourage people to reach out, network, learn about other examples, and bring those forward.
Yeah, and I guess just this past month, October 10th, the FDA had their first inaugural meeting with patients. It was related to medical devices, but at least that's a start. And I think there are about 47 different committees out there that they're talking to. So it's evolving for sure. Any questions?
You guys can hear me okay? Great. Hi, my name's Susanna. Thanks so much. Very interesting discussion. I was just curious, when we talk about patient voice, we've definitely engaged with patients in clinical trial work. I work over in Pfizer. And one thing that we always question is, did we get the full patient voice? Have we heard, how do we know we've heard everything? And I get you can't always hear everything. And how do you know you have the right voice in the room? So I guess I'm curious, because we've brought patients in, we've worked with patient advocacy groups to bring those patients in, or even through networking. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
That's a really great question, and I think it's something that you're doing it right if you're asking those questions. One thing that I think we need to be careful of is only using those super patients, if you will, right? The patient thought leaders, because they are wonderful, and they can bring a lot to the table, and they can talk about a lot of different patient experiences, but they are ultimately, them alone is one patient experience. And you tend to see that those are the super users on social media and who blog, but there are a lot of patients who aren't really, necessarily tech savvy and don't want to actively talk about their disease, and so they live, middle of the country or other side of the country from where your headquarters are. And we need to do, I think, a better job identifying those patients. And part of that comes from working with physicians and having them sometimes refer patients who would be willing to have that conversation. But I do think I have seen a trend towards working with online patients because they're the easiest to find. But if we really want to get a diverse range of patient voices, we need to make sure that we're, spanning across background, age, sex, et cetera, to really understand all the different patient experiences.
We have an exclusive online community called Patient Worthy. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. Yeah, so we've got thousands of patients that come every day to post stories, to blog. So it's a great way to also identify patients. Any other questions? Oh, we do have a question.
Hi, Dave Caponero from Catalyst Pharmaceuticals. Have you come across, I work in a couple rare diseases, of which we're experiencing patient bullying of other patients because they want you to go towards one discovery or something like that. Have you come across that? And what is your thoughts on it? Bullying. Patient bullying another patient.
Yeah, I would not want to use the term bullying, but I would use the term strongly encouraging in one particular direction. Yeah, we do experience that in the Duchenne community, and that's the only community I can represent here today. But yeah, there's a lot of strong opinions, especially when it's a pediatric disease and it's your child. There's a lot of strong opinions. And it is the burden of the pharma companies to sort through that.
Hey, well, it's lunchtime, so enjoy.
Yeah.